Design and construction of the Capitol Theatre and its associated commercial building occurred in the early 1920s. The first electric shadows danced across its screen on Friday the 7th of November 1924, so we're now just a month away from the Capitol's 85th anniversary. The 1924 opening was marked by a grand gala charity screening of Cecil B. DeMille's epic, The Ten Commandments. This was perhaps an unsettling choice given a recent structural failure somewhere else in Swanston Street, coupled with the film's second-half morality tale of a cathedral collapsing because of a greedy contractor skimping on the cement ratio in his concrete. Lest the Capitol be damned by association following the unfortunate events nearby, the theatre management took advertising space in the press in the week leading up to the opening, reassuring potential patrons that this massive reinforced concrete building was indeed structurally sound. The advertisements must have worked, as the Ten Commandments ran for an unprecedented 19 weeks, with its venue immediately setting new standards for the pre-talkie era theatre-going experience. In early December 1920, nearly 4 years prior to the theatre's glittering opening, the Griffin's associate and Walter's brother-in-law, Roy Lippincott, formally presented sketch plans for the project to their clients. Also that December, 2 days before Christmas in fact, Walter Burley Griffin resigned his position as Federal Capital Director of Design and Construction. And so ended what Roy would later bleakly, though entirely accurately, describe as 7 years of struggle and slander. He was, of course, referring to Walter's and, by intimate association, his wife Marion's experiences in seeing their vision splendid for Canberra, first lauded but then pilloried, twisted, distorted and diluted to the point where Griffin felt he had no alternative than to sever his connection with the national government. How had it come to this? In search of an answer, we need first to return some 6.5 years to Tuesday, 12th of May 1914. On that day, Walter Burley Griffin arrived in Australia for a second time. Waiting on the Sydney docks to greet the young American architect was an enthusiastic posse of pressmen, and the next morning's edition of the Daily Telegraph reported an optimistic Griffin as stating, "If people will back me up and take as much interest in the capital city as I do, well, we'll get along all right." His optimism was typical of the man. Yet over the next few years, Griffin's hopes for the orderly creation of what he had once described as an ideal city, unlike any other in the world, would be sorely tested and inexorably destroyed. As winner of a 1912 international competition for the design of a national capital for the recently federated Australian nation, the 37-year-old Chicagoan had, in the intervening 2 years, become something of a trans-Pacific celebrity. Griffin's design was praised, though far from unanimously, in Australia, Britain and Europe, and naturally his achievement was widely celebrated at home. Despite such fame, the more frivolous sections of the local Australian press preferred to see him mainly as a curiosity. On first sighting the handsomely fresh-faced Griffin in August 1913, Melbourne's Punch remarked rather snootily that architects in America dress the part, apparently. To Punch, Griffin was a long-haired, clean-shaven gentleman in a soft collar and a huge artistic cravat who seemed to be either a sculptor or a star violinist or a tragedian. He was none of these things. Mr. Griffin is an American. His appearance, his manner, his speech, all proclaim it. Of course, such outwardly trivial reports betray a wider and more unpleasant sentiment. Griffin was an outsider. As such, he would have far more to contend with than merely overseeing the progress of his capital plan. in the xenophobic and Anglophile corner of the world that was Australia in the early decades of the 20th century. When Griffin returned to this country in 1914, his brilliant wife, Marion Griffin, his sister Genevieve and her architect husband, the aforementioned Roy Lippincott, all accompanied him. In addition to being Walter's spouse, Marion was also his architectural partner. They had met in the early 1900s while both were employed in the studio of that egomaniacal genius, Frank Lloyd Wright, in suburban Chicago, and there been integral members of the so-called Prairie School, one of the most important movements in the creation of an Indigenous American architecture. But by the time of the international competition, the studio had been closed for the best part of 2 years, its demise precipitated by Wright's scandalous affair with the wife of a client. Out on their own, Walter and Marion had first entered an informal working arrangement that only later quickened to love. They married in June 1911. She was 40, her husband almost 6 years her junior. And unfortunately, there are very few portraits of Marion in existence, and this one, of course, predates her age of 40. What's interesting when you look at Marion's photographs, they're almost all in profile, whether it's because she thought this more theatrical or because she was, to put it frankly, she was somewhat a plain-looking woman, and she was possibly self-conscious of this, but right through her life she's inevitably in profile. And perhaps, jumping forward a bit, a slightly sort of fuzzy example is this picture when they actually came to live in Australia of bushwalking in the Grampians, where you can see Marion here in this great turban and trailing on the ground. It must have been an interesting thing to go through the bush with, but again, she's in she's in profile. Anyway, I proceed. The Griffin marriage heralded a remarkable and enduring partnership in both work and in life, one that was particularly unusual by the societal norms of the day. Most importantly, in the all-consuming sphere of their work, Walter and Marion were completely complementary. Walter was possessed of an almost uncanny spatial imagination, a powerful faculty for any architect. His three-dimensional imaginings were as natural as a breath taken and a breath exhaled. Yet, as a draftsman, he was stillborn. He could readily visualise his bold and monumental architectural forms, but faced persistent frustration at his limited ability to illustrate them to others. In Marion, he had found the perfect complement to his talents. In her skills abounded the other half of the whole. Not only was she the first female architect licensed to practice anywhere in the world, Marion was also widely acknowledged as one of the most accomplished architectural illustrators of her era. And this is a fine example. This is actually a drawing that was included in what is commonly known as the Wasmuth portfolio, which actually made Frank Lloyd Wright's reputation in Europe. And at least half of the drawings on which this portfolio was based are thought to have been Marion's work. When it came to the submission for the Australian competition, she was in every sense a co-author of that scheme, and the lucidity and simple beauty of her drawings did much to push Walter's scheme to the head of the pack. But her integral involvement in both the design and its visualisation was rarely promoted at the time, lest their combined efforts be dismissed as mere women's work. I won't say much about the Canberra drawings. Of course, they're very well known, but it's interesting to just note that the three I've just flicked through are just half of their submission. It was in some ways quite a spare but so beautifully clear presentation that it didn't need to be padded out with a great deal of documentation. It was a graphic and planning tour de force in every way. Griffin's initial appointment as Federal Capital Director of Design and Construction was to be for 3 years. The contract with the government would later be extended for a further 3, and as the end drew nigh, his tenure would be renewed at humiliatingly short 3-monthly intervals. On arrival in Australia in 1914, Griffin's small band of energetic and fervently hopeful Americans might confidently have expected to see the first stages of the competition-winning design steadily transformed from deft and graceful lines on drafting linen to three-dimensional reality amongst the dusty sheep paddocks of the Yass-Canberra district in southern New South Wales. However, within a month, Griffin had received his first lesson in the art of bureaucratic obduracy and obfuscation. Future prospects in an alien land for this band of outsiders must soon have looked anything but smooth. On the 10th of June 1914, Griffin met in Melbourne with Colonel Percy Owen, Boer War veteran, military and civil engineer and Director General of Works within the Department of Home Affairs, the branch of the executive with responsibility for the capital's development. At issue at this early stage of the project was the fundamental matter of sewage disposal. Griffin wanted to employ the latest in treatment methods witnessed firsthand on a 5-week fact-finding tour of Europe in early 1914. He sought details of water storage and reticulation from Owen in order to determine the practicalities of treating sewage within the city and using the effluent to irrigate open spaces and to replenish a series of ornamental lakes. In addition, Griffin was keen to appoint a number of consultant engineers drawn from both the relevant state departments and from private industry. Owen, though, contended that such matters were not Mr. Griffin's business. Griffin challenged this rebuff and referred to the authority of his contract with the government, to which Owen retorted, "Contract or no contract, I will give no information." Owen and others in his department believed that all works, railways, roads, bridges, utilities and even suburbs outside the city limits of the preliminary plan adopted by the government in 1913 were no business of the Federal Capital Director of Design and Construction. Work had already started on many of these undertakings during Griffin's absence and would continue under Owen's control. Griffin immediately complained to his minister, W.H. Kelly. In Griffin's words, Owen considered that design and construction should be independent of each other and that design, in his estimation, primarily concerns aesthetics. Of course, continued Griffin, my own understanding is quite the reverse. For his part, Owen feared that Griffin's idea was to assume the absolute control in every way of the construction of engineering works. No consultants were appointed, and Griffin's requests for information remained unfulfilled despite his repeated protestations. And to make matters worse, the tide of political fortune also flowed against Griffin in those early days. In the same month that Griffin met Owen, Joseph Cook's Commonwealth Liberal government was granted the nation's first double dissolution election, and as caretaker minister, Kelly went to ground. At the ensuing September election, Labor won office, and rather than the smooth, urbane and supportive Kelly, Griffin was forced to deal with former wharf labourer and union organiser William Oliver Archibald. The new Minister for Home Affairs took an instant and vehement dislike to Griffin. He was lumped in with Archibald's own ministerial predecessor and Labor Party member, the colourful and somewhat erratic King O'Malley, also an American, as being a Yankee bounder, one who was supposedly overwhelmed by selfish motives and interested in money and little else. And so a wearying pattern of poor relations with the Home Affairs bureaucrats and their political masters prevailed, eventually leading to an embittered and exhausted Griffin resigning his post. The full history of Griffin's Canberra is sad, complex, dramatic and frequently confounding, full of twists and turns, false dawns and dashed hopes, bloody-mindedness and catch-22 dilemmas, literally the stuff of tragedy. I believe that we are still acting out further scenes in that tragedy today. To develop my themes further, I'll again pose the question, how had it come to this? How had this mild-mannered, though fiercely determined architect, previously almost unknown outside America's Midwest, fallen out so quickly and decisively with the civil service mandarins of Melbourne? And how had he failed to garner sufficient support within the Parliament and also within his own profession? The seeds of acrimony and conflict were scattered long before Griffin's competition entry was ever adjudged the winner. There had been years of careful and at times seemingly glacial progress towards the selection and acquisition of the site for a grand and unifying capital, one that Austin Chapman, a minister in Alfred Deakin's second government, felt would be a city for all time, unique in its beauty and utility. Its proponents confidently predicted that Australia's capital would eventually be numbered amongst the finest in the world, the equal of Paris, London or Rome. Yet despite the future city's very existence being enshrined in the nation's new constitution, many within the Parliament, the bureaucracy, a parochial Melbourne press and the wider populace had nothing but contempt for what they regarded as an extravagant folly. To them, it was nothing more than the bush capital absurdity. Why couldn't Melbourne remain as the seat of national government, they asked. Since Federation, an international quest for the best design the world could offer had always been intended, but in the mechanics of the eventual 1912 competition, the search for the grand idea began to lose its way.